Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines this hour. Russia confirms talks with Ukraine and the United States will now take place on Wednesday and Thursday in Abu Dhabi. The Kremlin says the shift is due to scheduling coordination between the three sides. Iran denies receiving any ultimatum from President Trump on negotiations. Meanwhile, Tehran summons EU ambassadors after the bloc labels the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist group. Israel says the Rafah crossing will open today for limited medical transfers from Gaza. Only 150 people a day are allowed to exit, with 50 permitted to enter from Egypt. Drones target the airport in northeastern Kisa Anjani in DRC. Local authorities say 8 drones are neutralized and no casualties are reported. China sentences former Justice Minister Tang Yijun to life in prison for bribery. The ruling is part of Beijing's broad anti-corruption drive. Right-wing candidate Laura Fernandez wins Costa Rica's presidential election in a landslide. She secures a first-round victory after pledging a hard crackdown on violence linked to drug trafficking. Former UK ambassador to the US Peter Mandelson resigns from the Labour Party. The move follows fresh reports about his links to Jeffrey Epstein. Bad Bunny uses his Grammy acceptance speech to denounce US immigration raids. The Puerto Rican star tells the crowd migrants are human and American. We start this hour in West Asia, and Iran is finalising steps ahead of upcoming nuclear talks with the United States. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Bakay says they are reviewing and finalising each phase of the diplomatic process. He emphasised the importance of the method and working environment for the talks, which are expected to conclude very soon. Bakay also addressed regional concerns, stating that countries in the region are trying to play a positive role, unlike European nations, which he believes are escalating tensions. Iran hopes to wrap up the negotiations in the coming days, focusing on key diplomatic details. Let's listen in.
در رابطه با اینکه ساختارها به چه شکل خواهد بود، خب در این مرحله ما مشغول بررسی‌های مختلف هستیم. جنبه‌های مختلف موضوع رو باید بررسی بکنیم. کشورهای منطقه که خب هم دغدغه‌مند هستن نسبت به وضعیت جاری در منطقه و هم صادقانه تلاش می‌کنند برای ایفای نقش مثبت برخلاف کشورهای اروپایی که کاملا در جهت تشدید تنش دارن اقدام میکنند، واسطه پیام هستند. در این مرحله ما در حال بررسی و تصمیم گیری در مورد جزئیات هر روند دیپلماتیکی هستیم که امیدواریم طی روزهای آینده به نتیجه برسه. در مورد عرض میکنم نحوه انجام کار و اون چارچوبی که شما اشاره کردید به توییت دبیر محترم شورای عالی امنیت ملی.
Joining us now is Mohammed Osman, a Middle East affairs expert, joining us live from Cairo. Mohammed, as always, it's a great pleasure to get your insight on this. Of course, we've seen a diplomatic round of negotiations when it comes to Iran's nuclear deal occur before the 12-day war with Israel. Those failed. Israel, of course, struck Iran in a surprise attack, and it led to the United States striking 3 nuclear sites inside Iran. Now that these protests have scaled down, but of course we saw the deaths of many civilians, where does that put Iran and the United States on the diplomatic footing now?
Thank you for having me, Thomas. Always a pleasure to be with you. To begin with, this was never about the protesters and never about the protests. I don't think that the United States or the West or Israel really care about democracy in Iran or about the building of a new government in Iran that is more inclusive, that is less repressive, that is more secular. I don't think anyone cares about that. What the American really is how Iran is posing a challenge to its dominance in the region, to Israel's regional hegemony. The United States seeks to create a new regional order in the region, a regional system that will be led by Israel, a structure with Israel on top. And one of the main obstacles before that is the Iranian regime, love it or hate it. These are certain realities on the ground. And the United States see, even though they are not really involved or invested in the idea of regime change in Iran, however, they do believe that the nuclear threat is real, that Iran's missile capabilities are a subject of dire concern, and also Iran's role in supporting its proxies, militias and terrorist organizations and resistant groups around the region is something, of course, that harms U.S. interests and threatens Israel, the U.S.'s prime ally in the region as well. So this is what the U.S. cares about, whether they can achieve this militarily or through diplomacy. This is what they care about. And I think this is why we see the encouraging signs, very cautiously, of course. We view this at this point. I wouldn't say I'm really optimistic, but I do say that it is a positive sign that negotiations are being taken more seriously at this point. President Pezeshkian of Iran has instructed the foreign minister to prepare for negotiations. 3 countries have played a role in facilitating this diplomatic thaw of some sort. That is, of course, Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar. They played the central role in facilitating indirect conversations between the Iranians and the Americans in order to find grounds for talks at this point. However, on the other hand, we have Israel now, who is very eager to derail and spoil the entire negotiating process. And do you know what, Thomas? Probably they might succeed. So I do not believe that the prospects of escalation have diminished. I believe that so far, given the current variables, the military escalation is not an eventuality or inevitable. However, it is highly, highly probable, given the current circumstances, unless diplomacy progresses forward to some meaningful arrangements that they can both discuss and reach together.
Okay, Mohammed, do stay with us as we turn to our next story. And the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, has warned Iran that it must agree to major concessions and a drastic shift in its stance to avoid military strikes from the United States. Barrot emphasized that the US is prepared to strike, but has offered Iran a chance for negotiations. Let's listen in to his comments.
Les États-Unis se sont mis en situation de frapper l'Iran. Ils ont proposé à l'Iran des négociations dont l'Iran doit impérativement se saisir, consentir à des concessions majeures et à un changement radical de posture.
Okay, we now turn on to our next story. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that the Russian forces have intensified attacks on Ukraine's logistics infrastructure over 24 hours, with railway facilities emerging as the primary target. The renewed assault came even as Ukrainian authorities confirmed the full restoration of the national energy system following a recent technical failure, highlighting a shift in Moscow's focus towards disrupting transport and supply chains. The Ukrainian president said the update followed a high-level coordination call involving security, defense, and infrastructure. He also noted that while the power system is currently stable, the broader security and humanitarian situation remains severely strained due to the ongoing Russian strikes and extreme winter conditions. Okay, of course, this comes as they have announced trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi, which are coming on the 3rd and the 4th of this month. They're set to discuss an end to the war. President Zelensky will be bringing that security guarantees document with him, as well as other issues. But the sticking point, of course, remains territory, the Donbass. As Russia does advance it, of course, it has not taken the entire region, but wants it all, something that it hopes to negotiate for Ukraine to concede, even though it doesn't occupy the entire region. But, of course, Eastern European winter continues to be prevalent across the region. We're now joined by Major General Siddhartha G, a senior strategic and international affairs expert, joining us live from Jaipur. Thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. Of course, now we've heard that Ukraine's has said that the Russian forces have intensified the attacks on Ukraine's logistics infrastructure for over 24 hours, with railway facilities emerging as the primary target. We've seen Russia target both the energy infrastructure, logistics hubs, but also civilian infrastructure in general. How does that fees for their tactics when it comes to weakening the morale of the Ukrainian people and their soldiers?
Yeah, good evening, Thomas. Is that question for me?
Yes, it is indeed.
A lot, because any kind of exchange of fire onto any of the sides definitely is going to impact the morale and motivation of the troops on ground, whether Russia is firing towards the Ukraine. The troops of Ukraine are in fact going to be impacted, and so is the case Ukrainians firing towards Russia. The issue here is that if peace has to come about, then I think the start point should be the ceasefire, the freezing of all kinds of fighting activities. All guns must go absolutely silent. That's the only way to go ahead in the peace proposal. Otherwise, we'll be going round and round and without making any headway. Back to Thomas.
Indeed. Do stay with us, Major General G, as we move on to the diplomatic updates coming out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And Russia's Security Council Deputy Chairman Dmitry Medvedev has warned that the expiry of the New START treaty without a replacement should alarm the world. Speaking to Reuters and Russian media, Medvedev said the end of the last remaining US-Russia nuclear arms control agreement would leave the biggest nuclear powers without any limits for the first time since the early 1970s. While stopping short of predicting immediate nuclear war, Medvedev said the absence of constraints would undermine global stability. He stressed that arms control treaties are not vital for only limiting warheads, but also for verification, transparency, and maintaining a basic level of trust between nuclear powers at a time of heightened geopolitical tensions. Let's listen in.
Рубежная дата, ну вы знаете, наше предложение, оно остается на столе, и даже договор формально еще не истек, что если американская сторона захочет продлить, то это можно сделать, но в конечном счете мы оказываемся в ситуации, я начал тоже об этом думать, вот вся моя жизнь, ну начиная с 1972 года, прошла под зонтиком договора об ограничении стратегических наступательных вооружений, как бы он ни назывался. Почти 60 лет у нас не было ситуации, когда бы стратегические ядерные потенциалы не были ограничены чем-то. А сейчас такая ситуация возможна. Я не хочу сказать, что это сразу означает катастрофу и начнется ядерная война, но это все-таки должно всех настораживать. И вот эти самые часики, которые тикают, они в этом случае, ну, очевидно, должны опять же ускориться, потому что понятно, что вот эти потенциалы, количество боеголовок, развернутых носителей, это лишь способ контролировать ситуацию, но не решить проблему в целом. Но все-таки это способ верификации намерений друг друга. Если хотите, в чем-то, даже при всех издержках, это все-таки элемент доверия.
We're now joining by Sander van Hoorn, a former EU correspondent, joining us live from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. The START treaty, do you expect it to be signed once again, especially given the Trump administration's relationship with Moscow concurrently?
That's a big question. It all depends, of course, of one unreliable actor in this game, which is Donald Trump. No way of telling if he would want to re-sign the START treaty and if his contacts with Russia will allow it. I think deep down, both parties may want to restart it because the uncertainty of nuclear proliferation is just too big. But it all comes down, of course, as in with many things, to a matter of trust. Do parties trust each other enough sign it again. And that trust, of course, is one of the big issues in the world where other conflicts are also playing out. For example, in Ukraine, that is like a disturbing factor when it comes to renegotiating the START treaty.
There's no binding caps on US and Russian nuclear arsenals for the first time since the 1970s. What does a world, what does a world without any legally binding limits actually look like in practical terms?
Well, it comes down to the guarantee, if you like, of mutual guaranteed destruction, what you have to rely on. So then you will have to rely on the fact that one party is too afraid to use nuclear weapons because they know that the other party has second strike capability. So they know they can hit back no matter what you hit in the first strike, and that your country will be basically destroyed as well. But that's a deterrent that is there, and it's very powerful, maybe as powerful as any treaty. The problem is that while you have nuclear proliferation, you can make mistakes. So mistakes can be made, for example, over Ukraine. For example, if there's a Russian move on any of the Baltic states, mistakes can be made, and that can easily escalate to the nuclear level. And that's something that a treaty can prevent, and that the lack of a treaty cannot prevent. So that's the real danger, I think.
Sandra, of course, this was curated after the Cold War between the United States and Russia. However, China is not part of New START. Is it realistic to really imagine any future control architecture that doesn't include Beijing?
I don't see that happening, but there are more countries that are not included. Israel, for example, you have two nuclear powers, India and Pakistan. You have Northern Korea as a nuclear power. So you will have to rethink the way that those treaties work. And START, of course, was conceived in a world where we just came out of the Second World War. So the thought then at that time was never again, and never again two big countries fighting each other, never again a lawless world order. Well, yeah, look at the world now. I mean, the old concepts basically are dead, so new concepts have to arise. And any nuclear new concept will have to include China and India and Pakistan, preferably any nuclear power in the world. But the question is, will it?
Do stay with us, Sander, as we move on to our next update. And of course, developments about the Epstein files. Lord Mandelson has resigned from the Labour Party, saying he wants to avoid causing further embarrassment. The move follows the release of new documents linked to Jeffrey Epstein by the US Justice Department. The files appear to show 3 separate payments of $25,000 each, allegedly sent by Epstein in 2003 and 4. Lord Mandelson has denied any knowledge or recollection of the payments and has questioned the authenticity of the documents. He said his decision to quit the party was also intended to acknowledge the suffering of victims whose voices, he said, were ignored for too long. Lord Mandelson previously stepped down as Britain's ambassador to the United States over his association with Epstein. Sander van Hoorn joins us once again to discuss this. Britain's former US ambassador has previously denied knowledge of these payments, but he resigned to avoid embarrassment. Does stepping away acknowledge political responsibility, even if legal guilt is still unproven here?
So basically, this is causing a turmoil not only in the UK, but for example, also in Norway, and the association with Epstein is damaging already. So we've seen the British royal family basically taking very long with their former prince before he was made to resign from public life, basically. And I think people now feel the pressure to move swiftly.
Indeed. And of course, Mandelson is among a flurry of other individuals that have been named in these files. It ranges from Norway, as you've said, to the likes of Slovakia, particularly in Europe. Of course, many European officials and United States ones as well. what are your thoughts on the idea that, of course, things are hinted at, but the Department of Justice has said there are going to be no prosecutions following the release of these files. This is indeed all we're getting. Do you think that the US public will be satisfied, the European public will be satisfied by this release?
Well, there are two different questions, of course. The US public has a different relation with Epstein. So I think there will always be this hint about what are they hiding? Are they hiding something? If so, whom are they protecting? So that's the discussion, I guess, in the US. Here in Europe, it's something different. If you look, for example, at the situation in Norway, there has been email traffic, not really clear what it was about, if they ever met each other. However, the fact that this email conversation took place after Epstein was convicted in 2008, that shows, at least, no matter what the content of the emails are, a lack of judgment on behalf of the person communicating with Epstein. And look, building networks, that was the core of Epstein's business, if you like. So emailing him, contacting him may for some people have been a way to reach other people, to do business, to get in touch with other people. But doing that with a person whom you know has a conviction for sexual offenses, that's something else. And that's basically defining the discussion in the UK and in Norway as of now.
Sander Van Hoorn, thank you very much for taking the time and joining us. It's always a great pleasure to speak to you here on the broadcast. We now move on to our next story, and the United Nations World Food Programme says it is scaling up to deliver life-saving food assistance to reach 450,000 people affected by the country's worst flooding in decades. This comes just after Mozambicans recovered from the worst drought in its recent history. Severe flooding in central and southern Mozambique has impacted nearly 700,000 people, forcing over 100,000 into temporary accommodation centres. Around 15,000 kilometres of roads are now impassable, disrupting key supply routes and isolating vulnerable groups. WFP is using specialised amphibious vehicles, boats, heavy-duty trucks, fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters to reach the impacted communities with food and nutrition assistance. Let's in fact listen into what the WFP Mozambique country director has said.
The waterfall that you see behind me is actually Xai-Xai's main city. Xai-Xai is the provincial capital, and so on this road you had banks, you had gas stations, you had supermarkets, and all this has been underwater for a week now. WFP has been here also from day one, supporting the government's efforts, and the food is reaching people in very difficult to reach areas. We're using all means possible to do so, including amphibious vehicles.
Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.